good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the brief history and geography of Belarus. Let me get my pencil. Belarus is in Eastern Europe. As you can see here by this map, it is a landlocked country. It is bordered right here by Latvia, right here by Lithuania. Poland is over here. Ukraine is all down here. And then over here we have Russia, or like it says here, Russian Federation. But even though Belarus is landlocked, there is still plenty of water. Belarus has over 11,000 lakes, and there are many, many rivers crisscrossing, intersecting the country. Belarus is not very mountainous at all. It is very hilly. This part right here, you can see it says Belaruskaya Hrada, which means like the Belarusian hills. It's like there's like chains of hills more than mountains. It's not, there's no mountain climbing in Belarus. It's all very lowland, sort of like a drainage basin. This is what happens when glaciers recede. It leaves just like a hilly, wet area. Some of the famous rivers in Belarus would be the Neman, which you see flowing right down through here. We have the Pripyat, which you can see right down here. There's the Pripyat marshes as well. And we have the, and I really hope I'm saying this right, Dnieper. I've never known how to pronounce this river, and I've just kind of gone through my whole life trying not to say it. But I think it's Dnieper? Anyway, this river. And some famous cities in Belarus is, of course, the capital city, Minsk. It's by far the largest. The next largest would be down here in Homel. But as you can see, there are many, many different little towns and cities all throughout Belarus, all along the waterways. But that doesn't mean that Belarus isn't very forested, because it definitely is. Over 40% of Belarus is forest. It has some very old forests in it. And this zone down here we'll talk about in its history. If you caught the name Pripyat and know what that name is associated with, you'll probably figure out why this area is uninhabited. But we'll go through that in its history. So let's just dive right into it. Belarus has had many different peoples living in it early in human history. Many different, like almost nomadic kinds of peoples. Like there are a lot of Baltic tribes that lived in the area. The Slavs came into the region by the 5th century. The Huns and the Avars invaded and took over parts in the like around 400 to 600 CE. In the 9th century, it became part of Kievan Rus, which, as you can tell by its name, is a very important part of its history and pretty much established the people that live here today. There's a little thing over here in my book that says Belarus used to be known as Belarusia, a name that means white Russia, so you can see why the Kievan Rus coming in would be important in its history. But it also was invaded in the 13th century by the Mongols. It wasn't the hardest hit place in terms of Mongol invasions, but invaded it was nonetheless. And then in the 14th century, it became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. You can see Lithuania is right here. I've already covered Lithuania in my series, and I go way more into detail about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But it was, at its height, the largest country in Europe. And in the year 1386, it joined with Poland. Their two rulers, they married, joined families, I suppose, and became the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. During the next couple of centuries, Polish culture really forced its way into the territory to try to force out the old Ruthenian culture and language, implementing the Catholic religion as well. And they did altogether ban the Ruthenian language in 1696, which of course people weren't very happy about. People still spoke it and kept it alive. It's still around today, thankfully. But this region was not very well off because of invasions from Russia and even Sweden. And that came to a head in 1795 when Imperial Russia made the partitions of Poland, and in one of them they took over the whole territory here of Belarus and put it under Russian control. And they implemented like a more Russian culture and Russian language and Orthodox Christianity instead of Catholicism. There was a very famous revolt against the Russians in 1863 to try to preserve their culture and heritage and language, but they were beaten down, and Russian language and culture was enforced even more. This was when the language was forced to be in Cyrillic instead of the Latin alphabet. Let's jump forward to World War I. So, very famously, in 1917, the Tsar of Russia is overthrown and replaced with a communist government, essentially, the Bolsheviks. And the Germans took advantage of that and invaded the land that they had controlled while all the chaos was happening over in Russia. But then, of course, the Germans lost the war, and this territory, for the first time in its history, was just left alone with no one to tell the people here what to do and how to speak. So they declared their independence. They had it for a good solid year from 1918 to 1919 until Russia and Poland went to war, or I should say the Soviets, because it's not really Russia at this time. It was called the Polish-Soviet War, which of course Poland's right over here, Soviet Russia's over here. So the country basically got sliced in half, with the Russians controlling this half and the Polish controlling this half. This part was eventually merged with Lithuania, which the Russians also took control over, and the area became known as the Lithuanian Belarusian SSR, or Soviet Socialist Republic. Poland, meanwhile, while they had their grip on this area, tried to bring the Polish language and culture and religion back in, and people are like, you can imagine. But then World War II happens. In 1939, Nazi Germany very famously invades Poland, which kicks off World War II in Europe. So Russia swept in and invaded the half of Belarus that Poland had controlled. But the Nazis did invade in 1941 and remained here until 1944. And this was definitely the darkest days in Belarus's history. Like I always say on my channel, I, touch very, very horrific moments in history lightly. And that's because this is a relaxation channel. It's not meant to stress you out or go into gory details of anything in history. So, not to diminish or even make light of the situation here during World War II. I'm just going to touch on it briefly and move on so I can keep you all relaxed. But the Nazis did basically clean out the country. They took out whole towns, just leveled them. About 1,000 or so cities were destroyed. Millions lost their lives. They were deported out of the country to work in labor camps. There was a huge Jewish population in Belarus before then, and let's just say there isn't really a huge population of Jewish people there now. Very, very sadly, it's said that Belarus was probably the hardest hit country in Europe in World War II in terms of destruction and lives lost. But as we all know, the Russians came back in and took over their land, and it was absorbed back into the USSR, its own Belarusian SSR. And just like any other of the little Soviet areas, it was highly urbanized, industrialized, communism strictly enforced in the area. And for a country that had been so destroyed, a economy and government like that is kind of beneficial at the start, at least. Belarus was slowly recovering, and then in 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in what is now Ukraine exploded, sending nuclear fallout all over the area, and it actually impacted Belarus worse than it impacted Ukraine. So, like I said at the beginning, this area down here is still too radioactive to live in. There's no border enforcement, but it is highly discouraged that no one goes in this area. And there are plans happening right now to try to reduce the radiation in the soil and the trees and everything so that it can be inhabited again. But very, very long-term destruction from one human mishap. In 1990, the right kind of government was formed in Belarus so that they formally issued out their Declaration of Independence, so to say. And, after some talks with Russia, which of course the USSR is falling apart by this time, really, really weakened, Belarus managed to finally gain its independence. It became the Republic of Belarus. And in 1994, they had their very first and last free election, and Alexander Lukashenko was elected to head the country, and he has been there literally ever since. He has won every election since then, just very oddly and miraculously, right? He's been nicknamed the last dictator of Europe. It is essentially a dictatorship masquerading as a democracy. And that's just the truth. That's not even me putting in my opinion. It's literally a dictatorship at this point. Lukashenko has had a very firm grasp on this country and really is determined to keep it that way. He has a very weirdly close tie with Russia, in particular Putin. It's kind of like, I was trying to think of how to describe this. It's like Belarus doesn't want to be a part of Russia, but they just want to be Russia, like they want to be like a miniature Russia, so they ally themselves when they're needed, and disagree with certain things. There was a rift about the whole Crimea situation between Lukashenko and Putin, but the government of Belarus / Lukashenko is just like the #1 Russia fan, and it's very difficult because there are moments where they want to distinguish themselves away from Russian, like they speak Belarusian, still the same Cyrillic alphabet, but a very different language and grammar and things like that. But anyway, in 2020, miraculously, Lukashenko won the election again, and this time the people were over it. And there were huge protests against him, huge, massive protests. And as you can imagine, in a dictatorship masquerading as a democracy, it didn't end well for a lot of protesters, which made the protesters even angrier. And it's slowly snowballed. COVID-19 happening doesn't help anyone in that situation, but it's still an ongoing thing in Belarus. And it's kind of like what's going to happen at this point, we don't know, but there's really only two outcomes, one being that Lukashenko stays in power until he dies, or the movement becomes so powerful that Lukashenko is driven out of office. There's really no in between, so we don't know what's going to happen in Belarus. And me ending a video on that note now and forever is gonna upset me because that's how I ended my Myanmar video. I filmed it like a month or so before their election, which has been a nightmare. So I don't want to end a video on, well, I guess we'll see, because anyway, but I'm gonna end it on that note. Thank you so much for watching. Sorry this was a short one. I promise that longer videos are coming. I wish I had some things to show you about Belarus, but I don't. Maybe someday. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and above all, I hope that you have a very good